Thank you so much for that introduction, Jeff. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Mary Elizabeth Sutherland, and I'm a senior editor at Nature, where I handle research in the behavioral sciences, social sciences, which includes computational social science. Before introducing our session, I'd like to start by saying that Nature is standing in solidarity with those who are fighting to create a just, equitable, and inclusive society. We're supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and the Strike for Black Lives, and we will not be publishing our issue today or our podcast, and have stopped most of our day-to-day activities in order to reflect and think about what action we can do to tackle systemic racism in academia and also within our own ecosystem. And I have to say, I'm sorry it has taken us so long to do this. We've been invited to curate this content for the research stage, and after some discussion, we decided to continue with our participation in CogX. Our aim is to spotlight some of the most exciting research that we're seeing and showcasing in our journals, and to try to put it into context so that we can see how the insights generated by the researchers can be used to address important social issues such as the Black Lives Matter. As Jeff mentioned, this session is on computational social science, which is a field that takes approaches from computer science, engineering, physics, and mathematics to analyze, model, and simulate social phenomena. It's a field I'm particularly excited about because it allows us to learn about ourselves by finding patterns in our own behavior, the behavior of our social circles, what our countries do, cultural data. It lets us see patterns we otherwise wouldn't, and also opens up research to not just in the lab or responses to a survey, but to actual data. Because as we all know, the online world might not be exactly the same as the physical world, but it is a world that we all inhabit and that we use. It's exciting to see the research that is being done in these spheres, and I won't say too much more. I will let our two wonderful speakers, Milena and David, tell you about this. But before I briefly introduce them, I want to first state that the speakers are fully also support the movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, but have agreed to fulfill their commitment to the CogX organizers and to you, the participants. So we'll begin by hearing from David Lazer, who is a professor of political science and computer information sciences at Northeastern University. Before joining Northeastern, he was an associate professor of public policy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School and director of its program on networked governance. His PhD is in political science, and his research is on social networks and how the patterns of institutional relations yield functional or unfortunately dysfunctional systems, as well as much, much more. But instead of trying to summarize his research, I will let him begin his presentation. I look forward to hearing it, David.
Thank you, Mary Elizabeth, and thank you to the organizers. I'm going to switch my slides to, let me just go from the beginning. And I want to begin, as Mary Elizabeth was saying, to recognize this moment, I think both in terms of Black Lives Matter, but also the issues of representation in the academy. I recommend checking out some of the posts in Twitter under #Black in the Ivory. And I've shifted my talk today, or my brief remarks today, as a sort of discussion or reflection around data, computational social science, race, and power. And so I'm going to go through a few thoughts on this. I think one thing to reflect on more generally in terms of the science in this area, in terms of our society, is to think of information as accountability. And certainly we've seen that, the power of the smartphone as a potential tool for conveying information and as a way to keep our society and our institutions accountable. And I think there is a role for science in reflecting on and offering that kind of accountability. And I want to go back and think about the long history here. This is a wonderful visualization that W.E.B. Du Bois did for the 1900 Paris Exposition. You'll note that it plots the valuation of town and city property owned by blacks in Georgia in the late 19th century. And the interesting thing is how it embeds the change in that valuation with the changes in the political institutions in that time, political unrest, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and disenfranchisement, and how that then in turn relates to the changes in the economic prospects of blacks in the South during this time. And this was really truly doing excellent science, and unfortunately, much of the social sciences back then was really pseudo science. But this was really bringing, in some sense, the big data of the age, which was all this administrative data, to provide some accountability to the phenomena and the role that society was playing in either suppressing or enabling the prospects of blacks back then. So I want to briefly address the question of what is computational social science, and here I begin to thinking about the study of social phenomena in their richness, applying computational methods to study the richness of the complexity of interaction. So whether we're talking about network data, or geographic data, temporal information, that these are phenomena that have often, not always, but often been neglected in the study of the social sciences, which have really been much more focused on studying social phenomena. I often call it sort of rectangular social science, that is thinking of cases versus variables, but not thinking about the dynamics and relationship of the entities in the system. And I think this has been an exciting development over the last 10 to 20 years in the social sciences, and I think that there are, we can evoke precedent for this, and indeed, one of the interesting examples, again, thinking about evoking back to Du Bois, who was really well ahead of his time, was to look at the spatial and temporal elements of here you can see the particular, how well-to-do particular blacks were in this particular county in Georgia, the clustering in particular areas, and along the spatial characteristics of the county. That this is a rich portrayal of social phenomena that in some ways was lost, unfortunately, in the subsequent 100 years of the development of social sciences, that I think we're now evoking back to. Now, I think some of what we're seeing in current developments, and I'm going to be talking some about a lot, actually not just about research I'm doing, but about the field, is how then we can use these kinds of methods to detect bias in our systems, many of which ironically are based on computational methods, but then using computational social science methods to uncover the emergence of bias in those systems. Because unfortunately, a lot of the computational structures around our world are not truly neutral, but they capture or recapture some of the biases in our social systems. So in this wonderful paper, in not Nature, but another fine journal, Science, which talks about the biases in the commercial algorithms that help guide health decisions in hospitals. In this case, the algorithms were learning from prior data to predict future health costs, and then to say, oh, the people for whom we expect there to be more costs are the ones who we should prescribe more healthcare interventions for. But because there were biases in the delivery of healthcare, where African Americans were getting less healthcare, that the algorithm was actually under-delivering or providing or suggesting less healthcare for African Americans as compared to equivalent white patients. And this is just one example, and this is a very consequential example of racial bias in some of the computational structures in our world. But this is also a wonderful example of science being used to pull these systems to be accountable. Another example, and this is a wonderful piece in the New York Times, was looking at the changes in mobility. Actually, we've also done some research in this regard. This is more looking at the issues of class related to race, but how mobility changed in different cities over time, using actually data from cell phones to understand the changes in population behavior. And what we see, and this is actually some of our own research highlights this as well, but not as not with such pretty graphics as the New York Times, and this is nicely interactive, so I highly recommend looking at this, is the difference in the mobility changes between the top 10% versus the bottom 10% in these different cities. And what we can see is really radically different responses. And indeed, our own research highlights that the more affluent have been impacted by the current crisis in COVID-19, that they're able to shift to working at home, whereas less affluent either lost their jobs, or for those who did not, had to continue going to work, and thus were potentially exposed to the virus. And so again, I think that that highlights some of the inequalities in our society that these kinds of data can potentially reveal. All that said, I do want another lesson I want to draw here about all the digital trace data that are being used is that data doesn't equal truth. And let me give a nice little illustration. I'm going to pause here for 10 seconds. Let me ask you, if you don't know offhand, and I'm guessing very few of you do, how many floors does the Empire State Building have? Right. So if you could look up on your phone or your computer and find the answer, a quick answer to that question, I'll pause. All right. So I'm guessing that most of you, and if I was in a room, I'd ask you to raise your hand. I'm guessing that most of you found 102 floors was the right answer. In fact, it has 103 floors, but only the 103rd floor is generally used for maintenance and occasionally for access for the rich and famous, quite literally. And so it's an interesting what has happened here is that the Google algorithm has pulled out, and many of you may have seen like the box that Google pulls out on the Empire State Building, has pulled out from descriptions of the Empire State Building that it has 102 floors. But in fact, the algorithm misidentified that information, because if you look at write-ups, the write-up that Google identified it says in the lower paragraphs, by the way, there's a 103rd floor that most people cannot access. But all of that is to highlight that there's an issue here of how we are represented in data, both who is represented and what is represented, and on the how, and then how we represent ourselves. And I'll give you just another example from my own research, and then I'll come to a conclusion. We did actually we have a paper under review right now, actually at a Nature journal, where we surveyed people about whether they had had the flu. And then we looked at whether they had searched for the flu, and we were interested in whether having the flu was related to searching for the flu. And indeed, we find this is sort of the search rate, and we can see that the red is no flu in the household, and we see much lower levels of the flu for households where no one searched, and the blue is a substantially higher level. But when we look down and look underneath those data at the role that gender plays, there are some really striking discrepancies that we see that mothers in the household, when we ask them if they search for the flu, there's actually very little difference between households which had the flu versus didn't have the flu. Apparently, it seems that there is a background level of searching for information about the flu, whether or not there's flu in the household. In contrast, for men, there's just an enormous difference as to whether there's flu in the household. So the baseline level of men, or fathers rather, searching for the flu is pretty darn close to zero, I'm afraid. And then if there's flu in the household, there's this radical shift upwards in terms of searching for the flu And what we see here is, in terms of representation in the data, that there are these very different underlying behavioral responses. And to use, for example, searches for the flu as an indicator for whether there's flu in the household is actually contingent on particular social norms for using Google and for who would use Google, or in this case, Bing, to search for the flu. So the final thought I want to conclude on, again, this is in the notion of how do we speak, how scientists we speak truth to power, is that so much of our world is now computational, right? I mean, look at how we're talking right now. And these are institutions with enormous power, and that there are these computational structures that govern what we see and what we do. And so there is both an important role for thinking about the role we play as scientists for uncovering these processes, but also to think about how we engage with such powerful institutions, which are rich, which are powerful, and which actually play an important role in the propagation of science in these spaces. And so that's the question of how we speak truth to power when the power of these particular institutions literally touch us every single day, poses a very tricky conundrum for us going forward. I'm going to conclude with that thought, and we'll obviously circle around to all these issues in our discussion. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, David. That was a really interesting discussion about the way that we can uncover biases and things that we might not know by looking at these big data sets, and to think of how we can best engage with them. So I'd like to now move on to our second speaker, Milena Tsvetkova, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Methodology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She originally trained as a sociologist, getting her PhD in sociology from Cornell University, after which she went to do a postdoc in computational social science at the Oxford Internet Institute. I won't tell you about her work, and we'll let Milena take it away.
Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about computational social science and to present some of my work. So we're talking about big data, about online data, and one of the big questions that skeptical social scientists ask is always, well, can we learn anything about ourselves from the online world? Because not everyone is on the online world, and it's not really representative of everybody, right? So one answer to this is, yeah, that's correct. It's not representative, but it is a very significant social realm by itself. And I think this is more and more the case now. Because of COVID-19, a lot of our offline interactions have been interrupted, and a lot of our social life has gone online, right? Another kind of answer to this question is that if we look at the online world as a kind of a social system where individuals come in with their social desires, social needs, they bring them from outside, then yes, we can think of the online world as representative. It is a social system composed of individuals, and we can study fundamental social mechanisms and processes on there. So my research kind of comes more from this second line of thought. And I chose some examples to give you. I particularly focused because of the Black Lives Matter movement. I focused on some examples that have to do with segregation and inequality to make this more relevant. So let me start with a project that it was an experiment where we studied segregation. So there is a very popular, very kind of famous and established model in social sciences about segregation. And what this model suggests is that segregation is inevitable. So here, what I show in the upper left-hand corner is that we have very low levels of racial intolerance among a lot of nations. So, for example, in the United States, less than 5% would not want someone from another race, wouldn't mind if someone from another race would be their neighbor. But when we look at segregation in cities, we see extreme racial segregation. So Thomas Schelling suggested, well, this is inevitable. And this is because we have homophily. So we have a preference for similar others, and this would drive, even if it's a mild preference, this would drive extreme segregation. Now, we did an experiment when we tested this idea that, like, well, if sure we have homophily, there's this kind of a fundamental social mechanisms we cannot fight against. This defines a lot of our social interactions. But what if there is actually preference for diversities? What if we teach students, we teach children that diversity is good? We kind of, we have policies or kind of strategies in schools that diversity is something to aim for. And so we did an experiment in which we showed that indeed, actually, despite what models suggest, that in certain conditions, you could get a level of diversity if a lower level of segregation and a high level of integration, if actually people actively strive for diversity. So moving on to another experiment where we were looking at inequality. So this is a project in which we worked with a citizen science platform called Science at Home, based in Denmark, where we did, again, online experiments, and we are manipulating, we're still working on this, but we are looking at kind of under what conditions we would have an emergent inequality in groups where individuals interact with each other. So in this particular study, we looked at this idea that there is heterogeneity in the population. You can think of this as, our endowments, our resources, our innate abilities, knowledge, whatever you want to call it, and we're all different, right? I don't think anybody denies that we are different. But under what conditions would this difference translate into extreme inequality? And so what we found was that if individuals can see the wealth of others, so in this case it was the scores in the game, then you would have lower levels of inequality, right? So that's not necessarily the case if you can see the endowments of others. So if you can see their abilities, if you have information about their ability, you still have a high level of inequality. But looking at scores and wealth is important. So this has a relevance for example, talking about salaries in offices, in companies, or revealing grades in schools, right? So I am, most of my work these days is about inequality, and I'm trying to look at it from very kind of different angles. And so I have, for example, another piece of research where we used millions of lines of code submitted by volunteers on an online crowdsourcing platform called TopCoder, which publishes contests, programming contests. So we were interested here in the effect of social comparison. So what happens if the feedback you get about your performance, your code's performance, is relative to how others do, instead of, say, absolute, like where it is against some kind of exogenous scale, some absolute scale. And so what we found was that if there is social comparison embedded in this kind of feedback, those of low ability tend to lower their effort, while those of high ability tend to become more competitive and to increase their effort, and this affects their performance. So in the end, what you get is that social comparison increases the disparities in performance, and also, as a matter of fact, makes the performance of the low ability individuals more predictable. So in a sense, it kind of reinforces the status quo. And so again, this is one online context, but you can think here about other contexts, such as, for example, grading on the curve in some schools, of how this could be actually disadvantaging low skill individuals. Or also there is a very kind of controversial practice in offices called forced ranking, stacked ranking, where employees are ranked against each other. So this could also be discouraging for those of lower ability, for example. So finally, something that I'm very much starting to work on, and this is thinking more about how I can start using social media data to look at pretty much the daily reproduction of socioeconomic disadvantage. So how we kind of reinforce our position in society in daily interactions through our behavior, through our interactions with others, but then also through how others behave towards us. So this is something that I'm currently working on, and again, it all has a relevance to it kind of just represents to you my how I think about inequality and these ideas that first there are kind of fundamental processes that drive inequality from our interactions. But of course, this could also give us an idea about how we can address it, at least at a smaller scale, such as organizations or smaller communities. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Milena. That was a really interesting summary of a lot of work that you've been doing. I know it's hard to summarize in such a quick amount of time, but I think you did a really good job of showing some examples of how we can understand and look into the factors that can perhaps reduce inequality by your research. So I'd like to open up our general panel discussion now. And also invite any audience members to submit questions by Slido. I've been informed that we don't have a question and answer session, so if you submit those, I should be able to see them and integrate them into the conversation. So I think given the world in which we live today, which seems very different than the world in which we lived last year, I'd like to start by asking practically, what you think computational social science generally, or your research specifically, can contribute to, I would say, the two main crises that we are living, that is the systemic racism across sectors, through academia and basically every sector, and also COVID-19 and the spread of this epidemic. Let's start with you, Milena.
Okay, sure. So, I think that computational social science has a lot to contribute, especially right now, as I already mentioned, as we all know very well, a lot of interaction has moved online, which means that now we have even more data about social interactions. But to make this kind of more concrete, I have just a few examples. I think David mentioned quite a few already. So I kind of see it as two main areas. So we can expose the problems that this current situation is kind of caused by, or is also causing, and then we can also use computational social science to suggest solutions. So to start with some of my work that we're currently developing. So for example, we are using, again, these online games to study, to conduct experiments on group bias. And we're particularly interested to see what happens when your group identity coincides with wealth, right? So what if we have a rich minority in an interaction group? What if we have a poor minority? Would this affect the interactions both within this minority and and then also between the majority and the minority, right? So this is again at this very kind of abstract level, but again, it kind of can give us information about how, for example, prejudice could interact with economic inequality. So another line of research that I think is very important and will gain even more importance is something that David already mentioned, is studying algorithmic bias. So I particularly want to highlight the work of Aniko Hanak, that I believe David has worked with, who has been looking at using kind of algorithmic audits to study, again, it's unintentional bias in algorithms in, for example, online job market. So particularly she has a study on race and how, for whatever reasons, the algorithm that this online job market uses tends to show, say, black candidates, job candidates, at a kind of they're less likely to be shown as a top result. Right. And again, this is a very complex problem where it's not necessarily embedded in the problem, but into the algorithm, but it's an undesired effect from whatever goes into this algorithm. And so I think this kind of very different approaches could expose some of the problems. And of course, the other side is to offer some solutions. And so here, I recently came across a paper that came in Nature Human Behavior by Per Block and Melinda Mills, in which they used pretty much computational social science methods to look at different scenarios of isolating people in social bubbles and which ones would reduce the the rate of contagion. And again, this is kind of comes in a very right moment, because we've been hearing a lot of discussion, a lot of opinions, a lot of suggestions by experts or non-experts. But I think computational social science can put the science behind it.
David, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, a couple of things. I think that was a terrific summary. I think with respect to COVID-19, in some sense, this is the ultimate complex problem, right? It is a problem of the network, because it's about how we might infect one another, right? If we could just all sit by ourselves in a room without connecting with anyone else for 2 weeks, we could pretty much be done with the problem. But that's not feasible, right? And so as a society, and what societies across the globe have tried to do is try to modulate our connections to each other, shutting down K through 12, shutting down businesses, shutting down some mass transit, keeping it just to essential kinds of work. Again, lots of variations in different places. And so what computational social science can offer in this moment, and is offering in this moment, is to look at information on how these policies affect behavior, and how those behaviors in turn affect spreading of the disease. And so as I gave you a picture of those one set of images from the New York Times, but if you can go look at the Network Science Institute at Northeastern, where there's a group of us looking at how mobility is changing across the country and in different places around the world. And actually, Google is issuing these mobility reports for every state and every country in the world, almost every country in the world. That using those data will in turn allow us to evaluate what impacts which interventions are having on the spread of the disease. And the hope is to figure out less onerous ways to cut down on our connections, but still retaining some connections, so that we balance between the spread of the disease while needing the connections we need to survive in various kinds of ways. So that's just one example where computational social science is being used very expansively across many research groups to try to inform the kinds of interventions we're doing right now, and hopefully those insights will produce changes in policy that will save lives. I think otherwise, in terms of bias, I think there are lots of ways that computational social science is potentially offering insights into bias. I think Milena was highlighting Acha Hanek's work, which is fabulous. But more generally, we think about all of the, even in understanding human decision making and understanding larger scale data sets of, like, and I'll go back to, let's say, mobility, like how do different groups in society connect, right? We know about residential segregation, as Milena was just talking about, but then there's dynamic elements of segregation. To what extent do people from different parts of society even intersect with one another, and under what circumstances? And those kinds of intersections might be quite important in determining future economic opportunity. And so there are all these ways to look at race and inequality. Another, I would also point to the work by Raj Chetty, looking at IRS data, which is this massive scale dynamic data, which has never been thought of as research data. But one of the amazing things that Raj Chetty has done is to show the kinds of insights you can produce about the longstanding nature of inequality to address those issues.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I'd like to pick up on one of the points here, which is about the data. So it's something that you're just speaking of, David, and that featured in your presentation, Milena. So, David, you said something intriguing in your presentation, which is that data doesn't equal truth, which I agree with, right? I mean, Facebook data is data of people on Facebook, but who are those people on Facebook? It's not everybody, not the whole world. And it's a different ecosystem. So how do we find truth with our imperfect data? And I'd like to add a little bit from a question from Slido. somebody's asking how an entrepreneur, how do we not go down the wrong road, right? Because if let's say you have an algorithm that tells you what to do, but then you find out, oh no, there's actually biases in the data, so now it's actually systematically discriminating against Black people. So where do we find the truth with these imperfect data, and how can we give advice to people as to how not to be taken in by imperfect data, or by not seeing those caveats to the data?
So a few thoughts. One is, in science, you're never going to find the truth. You might, science is a method one hopes to, on average, move towards a better understanding of the world. The second point is, I'll just note that imperfect data isn't just distinctive to computational social science. It's just, all data have their imperfections, and there are particular challenges with respect to understanding human behaviors, in part because our understanding of the world actually changes what people think and believe, and so there's this recursive element to it. But in terms of how we, to the second part of the question, which is how do we not fool ourselves, right? I think part of it is that you have to interrogate the data for the kinds of biases that the data might introduce, and in particular, think in terms of, ironically, if you're trying to understand bias, you can't necessarily be you can't be race blind, right? In some sense, in the data, you need to see the divergent effects and relationships with respect to the data. And so you can see if in the data, you can see, let's throw race into the equation and say two equivalently sick people, one African-American, one white. Does the algorithm recommend the same level of care? And this is essentially what that science paper did, and it found the answer was no. And so in some sense, what you have to do is constantly interrogate your systems and your data and your decision making for the kinds of biases that might sneak in, either because of human biases or because of the algorithmic biases, which are in some sense reproducing the human biases that are just so prevalent in our society.
Yeah, thank you. Milena, do you have anything to add to that?
No, yeah. So that's I think David pretty much summarized some of my views. But I also wanted to emphasize that I feel like at this point there is no clean social data online, because when you think about it, all of our social interactions are mediated through an algorithm, right? And that's something to be constantly aware that when we, for example, study behavior on, say, on Twitter, people retweeting certain things. The thing is, Twitter uses an algorithm showing you, choosing what to show you, right, on your Twitter feed, right? And so it's very, and again, there is a need for also kind of accountability, algorithmic audits, and it's just very hard to disentangle all of this. And I think it's important to be critical, as David said, and to be constantly aware that what you're getting is not some ideal clean record, but it's a complex system where it kind of feeds on itself too.
Yeah, thank you so much. So this session is going by quite fast, and we're near the end. So I'd like to ask our speakers if they have any closing remarks. We'll start with you, Milena.
I think that I'm glad that we had this session, despite the kind of the debate we had whether to proceed or not. And I'm glad that we also managed to kind of shift our focus on how we can address unintended biases, but then also something that we didn't talk about was also how computational social science could address potential intentional abuse, right? And so this is something, so how people kind of intentionally use online systems and online services to disinform others, to polarize opinions, and so on. So I think that computational social science has a lot to kind of help with this. Unfortunately, as David also mentioned, is that unfortunately also it was computational social science that stands behind some of these phenomena, right? As we know about manipulating elections and polarizing fake news and so on. So I think that, again, computational science as any powerful tool could be used for good and bad, but we all have responsibility to at least as academics, to steer it in the way in which we have a more just and more equal society.
Thank you. And David?
Thank you, Mary Elizabeth, and I think this has been a wonderful session. I think we have special opportunities for creating insights about human societies right now, because everything, so much, there is so much more data about human behavior than existed just a few years ago. There's actually, this wonderful short story that actually Du Bois wrote over 100 years ago about something called it was called a medioscope, which was the idea that it took all these data in and then could give this remarkably detailed projection of human interactions and human behavior. And in some sense, in 2020, we're ready to live the science fiction that Du Bois wrote in 1910. I think that part of what's incumbent upon us, and this is not just about this moment, but it's about what's right, is to think about this as our socio-technical systems are being designed, is what are the normative implications of those systems in terms of winners and losers. These systems are built for a reason. They're built to extract certain kinds of revenues and profits and so on, which I'm not critiquing, but I'm noting that they're not necessarily meant to be designed to make humanity better off. But I do think that there's a role for the field of computational social science to incorporate these normative elements of human well-being, of understanding our society and trying to evaluate potential ways that we could make our society more equitable and more just.
Thank you. I would like to echo that point. It's something I find very exciting about computational social science, that it really does allow us to see things that we've been blind to before, these biases, and we know that that's the first step to correcting them. So I think it's a really exciting field of research that can be used to really improve our quality of life over the next 10 years. So thank you, both of you, for participating in this panel. It was a pleasure talking with you. I have many more questions, but in the interest of time, we will have to wind up now. So turn it over to Jeff.
Bye.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.